So now you, as the CEO, not me anymore,
Sure.
Garrett Daily Bird, I get to have fun and go out and speak to the troops and do the resiliency stuff and build relationships and help support Mighty Oaks from different platforms I have. Yeah. And I could thank you for that. But you lead this now. So how did you, obviously I know how it worked at Mighty Oaks.
Yeah.
How'd you get there? Like, a couple of things about your background is, you're a Marine Corps infantry officer. You're an infantry commander. Served in Iraq. In combat in Iraq, and that is what opened up your heart to being part of this mission of Mighty Oaks. But I don't think too often we've talked about how you grew up, why you became a Marine, why you became an officer, why'd you choose that route, and what led you on this journey to now be the CEO of Mighty Oaks.
Yeah. So, I grew up in a very conservative Christian home. My parents, and they're very conservative. My dad's a pastor for a long time, about 35 years. And so that was the environment that I grew up in, but it wasn't a military environment. It wasn't, I have two uncles that served kind of Vietnam era. My grandfather at 17 years old went to Europe in the Army, World War II. But the military was never something we talked about. It wasn't part of our family history. But my dad, being a very conservative Christian, was very pro-America and definitely instilled those principles of you need to serve something bigger than yourself and serve your community. And I remember when I was a kid getting a book that was written to boys in the 60s. It was a book my dad found at his parents' house. He was cleaning some things out and he gave it to me. I was 11 or 12 years old and read that book, and it was all stories of Congressional Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, but it was written in story form. And so it's, it's really exciting, but you start to get these thoughts of I could live for something bigger. I could do something bigger. About the same time, a couple started attending our church, the church that my dad pastored, and they were at the time, probably their late 60s, early 70s. And Mr. Edwards was his name. And he was a World War II veteran, part of the island hopping campaign as a Marine. And my dad would take me over to his house and we'd sit there and he'd tell stories. And again, you don't know it, but kind of by osmosis, you're developing a heart for that, right?
Sure, yeah.
And really felt like that's what God wanted me to do. And I don't know why, but I think it was all of those things, those inputs. And I remember talking to my dad about that when I was 14. Dad, I really feel like God would have me, enlist in the Marine Corps is what I told him at the time. He said, you can do whatever you want to, and we'll support it, but we want you to go to college first. And so, the Marine Corps was never an option for me. To me, it was like, well, if you go in the military, you go in the Marine Corps. Everyone I knew that was in the military was in the Marine Corps. The stories I read were Marine, so I went to enlist in the Marine Corps. And he said, you need to go to college first. My parents are both very educated, but they both received their education kind of at night school and, over many, many years as adults working jobs and raising families. So it was important to them that, myself and my sisters went to college. So I did. Another family friend said, if you're going to go to college, you need to go through a commissioning program. There's some great commissioning programs. And so that's what I did. And I was commissioned out of college into the Marine Corps as an infantry officer in 1999. Did a traditional deployment to Okinawa. And then we ended up in Iraq right at the beginning of the war, the 1st Marine Infantry Battalion. I was with 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, but that was the 1st Marine Infantry Battalion that went into Iraq, breached the berm from Kuwait going into Iraq, secured the southern objective of the country, and then made our way to Baghdad. Battle of Baghdad on April 10th was my battalion as well. So that was my combat deployment.
There's like this incredible video of you, you're talking to your Marines, and talking about all of these guys, because they wouldn't have had you probably wouldn't have had any Afghanistan veterans in your unit.
Yeah, no.
So these are all like first time in combat people, including yourself. Yeah. And you're giving this like, we're about to go across this line and we're going to get in a fight and people are probably going to die. Yeah. And and you're like 20.
I was 25 at the time.
Yeah, 25 years old, giving this speech to you're in charge of 75 Marines or so.
Yeah, I had 84 Marines in my platoon. Okay. It was, I always joke, it's like having a youth group at church, because the vast majority of those kids were under 20.
Right.
So 18, 19 years old.
And you were only 25.
I was 25. And and literally no one in our battalion, except for our battalion commander and one of the other company gunnies who was actually killed in combat in Iraq, had ever had any kind of combat experience. And they were both in Somalia. We had some Desert Storm vets, but none of them had been in combat. Right. If you're familiar with Desert Storm. And so, yeah, literally 1,200 Marines in our battalion, no one had ever been in combat.
So what was that like? Yeah. I've seen the video, right? But I never asked you this. Like, what were you thinking to give this speech? What was the morale of the guys like?
Yeah, I've been told a few times how impressive it was I could give an impromptu speech like that. I probably worked on that for about 4 months because I knew eventually that day would come. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't impromptu. Like I had worked through, I didn't know much, but I knew that if we crossed the line of departure and went into Iraq, that's an historical moment. And, I knew enough about history to know I've got to say something important and clear. And so I just wanted to charge those guys with how big this is, how important this is.
Can you summarize a little bit? Because I know people can look it up, but
yeah, I said something about, this is a historical moment. America has always been the watchman on the walls of world freedom, quoting President Reagan. Talked about our training and how we had been, we're prepared for this, depend on your training, depend on each other. It wasn't, a deep speech or anything like that, but just wanted to reassure them we're ready for this, and whatever happens over there, we're ready for it, and we trained for it, and we're going to be okay. And I didn't have any experience really to back up what I was saying, but I believed it was true. And this is where history helps, is learning the stories of other men and women who have gone into situations very much like that, but with good training, we're able to execute. And that's what I wanted to convey and wanted to communicate. And so,
how'd the Marines respond? Like,
yeah, it was,
I know a lot of
like Marines. I mean, they responded with an hoorah, and that's right. And we're going to get it done. I had one of the a unique opportunity with that platoon that I trained with them for about 2 years, which is a long time in infantry years to be with the same Marines for that long. And you do know a lot of those guys. And so we knew each other really well. We had a good bond of trust. And I think they trusted me to the extent that they could. Again, none of us had been in combat before, but we all knew each other's strengths and weaknesses and where we needed to be. We had good NCOs and staff NCOs. And so we were ready. And I think at the time, what I felt like was important was projecting that I'm confident that what we're doing is the right thing for the right reason, and we're going to be okay once we start moving. And they responded well to that. And it was that night we made that movement. It was supposed to be the next day, got moved up 12 hours, made a nighttime movement, and breached the berm and went into Iraq.
You talk about this a lot. Like, we're in the age of this giant LCD screen behind us right now.
Yeah.
That time, 2003, there was, technology was a lot different.
No, it was very different.
And there was no FaceTime with your family or anything like that. Like, how long, you talk about, I forget the time frame, but you went without speaking to your wife.
Yeah, I had spoken to my wife. We had an AP reporter with us, and he had a sat phone. So I think during my entire 6 months I was there, I must have talked to her for 6 minutes, less than 10 minutes during that entire time. Yeah. And that was when he'd say, hey, call real quick or something. And you're calling in the middle of the night. And so it was a different world. Even the vehicles we were in Humvees, but they were pulled off of shipping. They were put on ships in 1990 and waiting for this kind of event to take place. And so there was no armor. We put sandbags on the floor, sandbags on our seat, sandbags everywhere we could. And, in front of even the glass and the windshield. We had an onboard computer on my vehicle. Mine was the only one. It went down even before we crossed the border. I was responsible for navigating the battalion, which again is 1,200 Marines, a lot of vehicles. And I did that with a Magellan GPS that I bought at Target before we left the United States. And I'd hold it out the window to get a signal. And then I had a map book. It was literally 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper bound in a book. And I would flip to whatever page it was and find that 6-digit grid and hold it out here and know we were in the right place, and we'd keep pressing. So yeah, very, very different. In fact, I've made the statement before, the war that I was involved in Iraq was very different than the war that those who came behind us were involved in. It was a completely different world.